Everything we do involves risk. In Mod 1, we will examine how audience perception of risk drives how we conduct risk communication before, during, and after a crisis. We will consider the unique features that distinguish risk communication from other communication approaches. We will introduce the view that risk communicators exist throughout an organization, involving both formal and informal interaction with employees, networks, customers, and community. These slides were prepared by the National Center for Food Protection and Defense, a Homeland Security Center of Excellence. The risk communication team is seen here in this slide. We gratefully acknowledge and thank them for making these slides available. In this video, we'll be covering 3 topics. First, we'll define risk communication, what it is and what it isn't. Second, we'll move on to risk perception and consider the facts and feelings involving risk communication. Third, we'll be considering the idea that we're all risk communicators, and it is your job. The learner outcomes for Module 1 are to learn to apply the risk communication goals. We'll be using the example of a foodborne outbreak. A second outcome is to describe the function of risk communication within the risk management model. Third, identify the factors that drive perceptions of risk. And fourth, compare and contrast communicator roles from various segments of the communication system. Again, we will use food as the basic example. Module 1 will introduce you to definitions and concepts that serve as the foundation for sound risk communication practices. Let's begin with a definition of risk communication. The United States Department of Agriculture definition says risk communication is an open two-way exchange of information and opinion about risk, leading to better understanding and better risk management decisions. Another definition frequently cited is from the National Research Council. It says in part, risk communication is an integrative process of exchange of information and opinions among individuals, groups, and institutions. It often involves multiple messages about the nature of the risk or expressing concerns, opinions, or reactions to risk messages or to the legal and institutional arrangements for risk management. 3 primary risk communication goals can be identified. First, you want to tailor communication so it takes into account the emotional response to an event. Second, empower audiences to make informed decisions. And third, prevent negative behavior that hampers response or causes more harm, and encourage constructive responses to crisis. Here's a real message. Consider what risk communication goals are reflected in this message. The best way to guard against the flu is to get vaccinated, which helps to protect you, your loved ones, and your community. How does this statement take into account the public's emotional response? What constructive behavior is encouraged? How does this statement empower audiences to make informed decisions? Here's another example. We are very concerned for those who became ill, and our thoughts are with them as we continue to work closely with health officials as they try to determine the root cause of this. While the authorities do not know the source of this contamination, they have said there haven't been any new cases since November 29th, so they are confident that it is most likely no longer a threat. How does this statement take into account the public's emotional response? What constructive behavior is encouraged? Here's another example from 2006. The idea that salad greens have become a source of E. coli is very shocking, and it means we have a real problem in the food system. This is very serious. What goals are reflected in this risk communication message? While the last example takes into account people's emotional response to an event, consider what goals this message accomplishes. We have not with certainty traced the illness to any specific product or source, but people in high-risk groups for developing listeriosis, particularly pregnant women, the elderly, and persons with compromised immune systems, should take precautions. This message empowers informed decision-making. Here's an example that encourages constructive action. Spinach is high in antioxidants, which can protect against heart disease and cancer. If you're having a hard time finding spinach, there are lots of other greens with nutritional value. We should not forget about mustard greens, bok choy, kale and chard, broccoli and Brussels sprouts. I would suggest things like romaine lettuce and arugula. Here's a risk communication message concerning restoring public trust following the spinach outbreak in 2006. Farmers approach it as the most serious concern that they have. The most important commodity that we have is the public trust. This message is taking into account people's emotional response to this event. Risk communication differs from a traditional communication approach. A basic communication model is unidirectional. It's a we tell them approach. You have to think about who's going to say what, when they will say it, to whom they will say it, through what channel, and with what effect. The risk communication model, by contrast, is multidirectional. It actively involves the audience as an information source. So the key concept to take away here is that the audience has a dynamic role in the risk communication model. Let's consider a couple of components of risk communication. We just said that it's multidirectional and it actively involves the audience as an information source. Here are some of the key components. Audience assessment. You have to know the public. Audience involvement means to involve the public as partners. The message is important. Information content is critical. Logistics, that concerns how you get the content, how you get it to the audience, how you get their response back. Listening for the audience response is very important. Meta messaging is how you say it. This reflects how the communicator and the audience feel about the event. You'll hear more about meta messaging as we go through the course. Self-assessment is ongoing in risk communication, and evaluation is very important to gather those lessons learned. We're going to talk about risk communication outcomes, but let's begin by asking what is not an intended outcome. For example, there are some commonly misunderstood outcomes that are not intended. Risk communication is not intended to make people feel safe, less anxious, or to avoid panic. It's not intended to assure the public that their fear is unwarranted. What risk communication is trying to do is to decrease illness, injury, and deaths, to build support for a response plan, to assist in executing a response plan, to prevent the misallocation and wasting of resources, to keep decision makers well informed, to counter or correct rumors, and to foster informed decision making concerning risk. Risk communication is only as good as the effectiveness to implement the plan. Katrina's evacuation was a great example of that. Many disciplines have contributed to risk communication principles. Risk communication has evolved from a number of these contributing disciplines. The Environmental Protection Agency sought help bridging the gap between expert and lay perceptions of physical hazards. Psychologists answered by studying perceptions of hazard. Philosophical and sociological work focused on culturally shaped meanings of risk. Political science looked at decision-making based on risk. Communication scholars engaged in message design research. So you will see many different disciplines have contributed to the development of risk communication and its principles. Risk communication includes communication strategies before, during, and after the event, or we could categorize them, as you see here in the slide, as preparedness, response, and recovery. Preparedness and recovery involve planned, tested, strategic communications. They focus on pre-event activities. They are multi-directional, proactive, and certain. Crisis communication is one form of risk communication, and it involves the response to an emergency or crisis. These types of communications are spontaneous, they are post-event, unidirectional, reactive, and equivocal. So let's consider pre-crisis. What types of risk communication messages are we seeing in anticipation of a flood or a pandemic outbreak? The answer would be to raise awareness or fear to prompt preparedness actions. Now let's consider post-crisis. What types of risk communication messages have appeared following a flood event or the spinach outbreak that occurred in 2006? And the answer would include constructive actions, empowering decisions by those affected by the events. So this would be, for example, knowledge about how to avoid disease in the post-flood recovery, how to obtain help from the government, or in the case of the spinach outbreak, awareness of cross-contamination hazards, or how to properly prepare a product. Let's summarize these basics by thinking about what risk communication is not. It's not spin, public relations, damage control, crisis management, how to write a press release, how to give a media interview, nor is it always intended to make people feel better or reduce their fear. For balance, let's consider what risk communication does. It considers human perceptions of risk. It is multi-directional communication among communicators, publics, and stakeholders. It includes activities before, during, and after an event. It's an integral part of an emergency response plan. Risk communication empowers people to make their own informed decisions. Risk communication is a combination of facts and feelings. Risk perception drives risk communication. Communicating about risk is difficult because of the way people interpret risk. There's an intersection of facts and feelings. Risk sets the stage for emotional issues that capture headlines. Let's review a couple facts about our risk analysis paradigm. Everything we do involves risk. There is no such thing as risk-free activity, and that's largely because of the uncertainty in the world. Zero risk is unachievable in our personal lives and in our professional duties. So it's important to remember that options exist for managing every risk. Communicating about risk is difficult because of the way people interpret risk. This involves competing perspectives. There's the objective interpretation of risk that professionals pursue, and there is the subjective interpretation of risk that consumers intuitively respond to. So take a minute to think about what are some of the contemporary issues that you get involved with that represent these competing perspectives. When it comes to food, there are many examples: irradiated food, cloned meat and milk products, organic foods, water fluoridation, pesticides, imported foods, trans fats. All of these have very objective dimensions of risk, but there are some very subjective reactions to these issues as well. We're going to try a little group experiment online and virtually. So let's see how this is going to work. The purpose is to demonstrate how we all interpret risk differently, both based on both subjective and objective analysis. So we're going to examine how you would interpret risk in the case of euphoria. So let me tell you a little bit about euphoria. It was developed by a leading research university. It was 16 years in the making. It provides short-term memory boost and pleasant feeling in times of stress. It lasts for 24 to 36 hours, and multiple trials have examined potential short-term and long-term side effects. Now, what I would like to know is, now imagine here that we're in a group. Would you take the euphoria pill? So what I would ask the class to do is for everyone to stand up. And to stay standing if you would be willing to take the euphoria pill, even if the odds of developing severe diarrhea were 1 in 1 billion. So would you take euphoria if 1 in a billion people had severe diarrhea as a response to the euphoria pill? If you're still standing, then let me ask you, would you take it if 1 in a million had this response? If you're still standing, how about 1 in 100,000? If you're still standing, 1 in 1,000. If 1 in 1,000 people had severe diarrhea in response to euphoria, would you take it? How about 1 in 10? And finally, to force your hand, side effects are seen with every dose. Even so, some people would likely still take it. So in a class, we would expect to see people sitting down at different times. And what we would like to know is, why is there a range of responses? What does this tell us about risk perception? And the answer is really very simple. Perceptions of risk are highly individualized. Different factors shape risk perception. Here are some considerations that do shape perceptions of risk. The hazard itself, something that can go wrong, something that can cause harm. Probability, that would be the likelihood of that harm happening. Consequences are the implications of the hazard, the nature of the harm, whether it's property loss, personal injury, illness, death, whatever it might be. And then there is value. This is the subjective evaluation of the relative importance of what might be lost. So if we apply these components to the euphoria exercise, the hazard would be severe diarrhea. Probability would be those odds, 1 in a billion or 1 in 10, and so forth. The consequences would be dehydration and all that goes with diarrhea, including embarrassment and limited mobility. You can't be too far from a bathroom. The value involved here would be the memory boost and feelings of well-being. And so the way that people subjectively evaluate all of that would determine who stands up for how long for euphoria. The same is true for all risks that we face. Risk perception factors involve both thinking and feelings. Thinking or logic focuses on the hazard, the danger, and also on the probability. That would be the likelihood or chance of it occurring. Feelings involve fear, anger, and other emotions that are evoked when considering potential consequences and the value of what may be lost. So as it turns out, professionals tend to focus more on the thinking aspects of risk, the public tends to focus more on the feeling aspects of risk. But you should certainly expect that there would be mixes of thinking and feeling in most perceptions of risk. You are the scientists and the experts. Your orientation tends to be fact-based. It focuses on the hazard and the aspects of the hazard that are scientific and knowable, and on probabilities. You know things, you think things because of your job, because of your education. So you approach risk in a very different way than the consuming public. Their orientation is value-based. They are swayed by the things that they feel, the things that they believe, and they come at risk from a value-based perspective. That's one that emphasizes consequences and value more so than the hazard and probability that you as professionals are identifying. So this sets up a fundamental scientist-consumer disconnect that can make communication very difficult if you're not well aware of it. Here's a great example of the scientist-consumer disconnect. It's a quote from a U.S. Agricultural Undersecretary who was commenting on the Japanese import ban on U.S. beef in January 2006. So people were concerned about hormones in U.S. beef. And the Secretary's response is as follows. In fact, probably getting out of your automobile and walking into the store to buy beef has a higher probability that you'll be hit by an automobile than the probability of any harm coming to you from eating beef. This person is totally unaware of the consumer's response, their feelings and beliefs, the values that they're placing on this hazard of. What the Undersecretary says is absolutely true, but it's also absolutely irrelevant to the concerns of the public. Hormones in beef. Here's another example, the U.S. consumer response to mad cow disease in 2003. This editorial cartoon captured the nation's response to mad cow disease, where scientists and public health experts characterized a very small danger given the safeguards in place, while some consumer groups and politicians raised alarms which captured media attention and fed the fear factor. Peter Sandman is a leading risk communication expert and a member of the risk communication team that put these slides together. You'll want to make sure that you bookmark petersandman.com. Great resources there. I highly recommend that you spend time going through them. In any event, this quote, "The risks that upset people are completely different than the risks that kill people," refers to the fact that there is virtually no correlation between what upsets you and what can harm you. Sometimes we're upset about serious risks, sometimes about silly ones. Take a moment to think about some of the risks that upset consumers in your area of expertise. Here are some examples of food-related risks that upset consumers. Early in this program, you learned a risk equation. Risk equals consequence times probability. Here's a second one. Peter Sandman was the first to articulate risk in just this way. Risk is a hazard plus outrage. Hazard refers to the danger and the probability of that danger. Outrage refers to the fear, the dread, the anger, the emotional response that we feel to the presence of a danger. According to Sandman, outrage is every bit as real as hazard. Both are measurable. Both are manageable. And, mathematically speaking, if one is zero, the other could still be a non-zero factor. So the way the public perceives risk is more in line with this equation. The way you as experts see risk is more in line with the original risk equation that you learned. It's important to understand that these different perceptions of risk lead to different risk communication approaches. The level of hazard and the level of outrage determine the risk communication approach. So notice the horizontal axis goes from low hazard to high hazard. The vertical axis goes from low outrage to high outrage. And the combination of outrage and hazard give us 4 different distinct risk communication approaches: public relations, precaution advocacy, outrage management, and crisis or emergency risk communication. When hazard is low and outrage is high, you need an outrage management strategy. Here the goal is to reduce outrage so people don't take unnecessary precautions. Some examples for outrage management would include the mad cow problem, people's concerns about genetically modified foods that they prefer to call frankenfoods, cloned animal products, and undue concern over dam and levee safety, for example. When hazard is high and outrage is low, it's time for precaution advocacy. The goal of this strategy is to increase fear to motivate people to take preventative action. Food examples for precaution advocacy include salmonella in undercooked poultry, mercury in fish, high-fat diets, Vibrio in shellfish, raw milk and cheese, undercooked ground meats. People who live along the coast and fail to heed evacuation warnings would also be examples where precaution advocacy would be needed. When hazard is high and outrage is high, your strategy is different again. Your goal now is to acknowledge the hazard, validate the concern, and give people ways to act. You are right to be concerned about this storm. It is a killer storm. Gather your family, your prescription drugs, get into the car, and evacuate the island now. Examples in food safety would include the E. coli spinach outbreak, a bioterrorism event, or a food recall. To see how you're doing with these concepts, one of your homework exercises is going to ask you to identify issues within your organization for each of the different communication approaches. The last topic discusses the role of the risk communicator in various segments of the organization. Traditionally, risk communication has been centralized in the public information officer or the spokesperson function. That would include the industry CEO, the organization or agency head, a communications director, or other official spokespersons. So think about who are these spokespersons in your organization. Let's use the food system as an example. Risk communicators from the food system serve many roles and functions. Foodborne outbreaks or emergencies will usually involve risk communicators that include official spokespersons, communication staff members, and subject matter experts. They participate in press conferences, they prepare statements, address the public in meetings, they are consumer service reps, and so on. These persons should be trained in risk communication as part of an organization's preparedness planning. So in a similar fashion, think about your own industry and who all the different risk communicators are and who all the people are who need risk communication training. This slide continues some food system risk communicators. An alternative to this traditional model is that we are all risk communicators. Risk communication occurs in many settings. It's important to recognize the importance of the many communicators within your organization. They can include informal channels and networks, such as neighbor-to-neighbor communication, the rumor mill, online blogs, person-on-the-street interviews, talk radio, and others. So think about, what are the formal communication channels used by your organization? And what are the informal information channels used in your organization? This brief case study will illustrate the importance of the informal risk communicators. Schwann's is a privately owned company based in Minnesota that features home-delivered food products, including ice cream. In 1994, an estimated 224,000 persons were exposed to salmonella-contaminated ice cream. The cause of the problem was that tanker trucks carrying raw eggs had not been adequately cleaned before ice cream premix was added. That ice cream premix was contaminated with salmonella from the raw eggs, and that found its way into the ice cream that Schwann's delivered all over the Midwest. So home delivery drivers were instrumental in communicating with customers and restoring trust in Schwann's products. And that's a key concept to get, that everybody is a risk communicator. So think about, who are the employees in your organization who would serve a similar function if you had a disaster like the Schwann's ice cream outbreak. Risk and crisis communication is an ongoing process. It's not something that's just done during a crisis. You implement as preparedness, response, and recover strategies. You incorporate risk communication into the policy development process. You continuously evaluate and update crisis communication plans. See you in the next video.